Hi, I'm Dana Hunnes, and welcome to today's UCLAMDChat. Today I will be discussing sustainability in honor of Earth Day, and I will be talking about how our behaviors, habits, and diets influence the environment. Now, a lot of us, when we hear about Earth Day or talk about sustainability, we talk about turning off the water, or limiting our driving, or turning off the lights. But today, as a dietitian, I have the honor of teaching you something a little bit about diet. Now, I'm a clinical dietitian at the Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center and an adjunct assistant professor in the Fielding School of Public Health, where I studied climate change and food security. So I wanted to start out with Albert Einstein, who was way ahead of his time back in the 1940s when he said, "Nothing will benefit human health and increase the chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet." So if that doesn't give you a hint of what I'll be talking about today, we can read it again. So to begin with, I just wanted to get your mindset thinking about what I'll be talking today. So I started off with a little pop quiz. First, what percentage of global greenhouse gases come from agriculture or our food supply? Now, I'm not expecting you to know the answer, but I'm hoping this will get your mind thinking about it. What percent of food is wasted or trashed each year? How many plastic bags and plastic bottles does the average person use in 1 year? It's a lot more than you think. What percent of fisheries are overfished? And how many gallons of water does it take to make 1 gallon of cow's milk versus 1 gallon of soy milk? The objectives of our lesson today is to understand how dietary habits contribute to climate change and the environment at large. Understand how single-use plastic products end up in the ocean and eventually into our food supply, affecting us. And understand fishing methods, fisheries, and why perhaps that sustainable fish you've heard about may not be so sustainable after all. And finally, understand what you can do to be more sustainable. Now, I've given this talk once or twice before, and it usually starts off a little on the depressing side, but believe me, you'll learn a lot, and at the end, I'm going to give you the tools and the tips that you need to be more sustainable, so don't give up hope yet. So to begin with, greenhouse gases. Now, a lot of us have heard about greenhouse gases from electricity, from coal, from driving and transportation, but what a lot of us probably haven't heard about are the greenhouse gases that come from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And that represents nearly 1/4 of all greenhouse gases globally. And that's more than people driving every year around the world. The majority comes directly from deforestation and agricultural emissions from livestock. Think the cows farting and the milk. And of these greenhouse gases, almost 80% come from animal agriculture. So as I said, the ruminant animals. And that comes in the form of methane, which is about 23 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And deforestation is itself a releaser of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And unfortunately, there's deforestation occurring primarily in the Amazon to make more land for the cattle or their feed. So as I mentioned, crop and pasture land represent about half of all the ice-free land area on Earth. The other half is pretty much populated by humans. Deforestation, particularly in the Amazon, as I mentioned, is picking up pace around 32 billion acres per year to meet the increasing demand for animal products globally. And roughly about 2/3 of this land is used for grazing or animal feed. And this will increase with a growing world population. So right now, there's about 7.5 billion people on Earth. The US average intake of meat is about 200 pounds per person per year, while in developing countries, it's about 63 pounds per person per year. By 2050, we're expected to have about 10 billion people on the planet. That's about 1/3 more people on the planet than there are today. And by 2100, about 11.2 billion people, another 50%. Now, most of this population increase is expected to occur in developing countries. But as urbanization and improving economies occur, a lot of these people are going to want to be more like us, eating more meat, to the tune of about 93 pounds per person per year. So you can imagine that with 50% more people on the planet wanting to eat 50% more meat each, that's going to be a lot of animals that we're going to have to raise. Another thing about agriculture, forestry, and land use is that global agriculture pollutes fresh and marine waters with agricultural chemicals and runoff, leading to dead zones. So all of this represents, in the Gulf of Mexico, agricultural runoff and also pesticides and things of that nature. And the dead zones mean there's so much nitrogen in the water that other fish and other plankton and other marine life just can't survive there. Now moving on to food waste. Food waste contributes about 3.3 gigatons of carbon every year, mostly from methane, and that occurs when underground the fermentation process is an anaerobic process, and so that creates methane. Now, as you can see here, China and the United States are the two largest greenhouse producers in the world, but food waste is number 3, even before many other countries. Globally, about 1/3 of all food is wasted, and in the United States, that number is almost 40%. Spoilage can occur along the supply chain where it's discarded in the warehouses or even on the farm, and it can also be thrown away at home by consumers or in restaurants. These wastes also waste huge amounts of water resources. And in fact, globally, agriculture accounts for about 70% of all water withdrawals globally. And do you know how much of the water on Earth is freshwater? Just 3%. And most of that is locked up in glaciers in Greenland and Iceland. So when you think about it, almost all of the fresh water we are withdrawing from Earth is used to grow food. Now moving on to plastics. A lot of us don't think about our plastic use, but plastic's in everything. Modern plastics were first developed in 1907. Today's major thermoplastics were commercialized in the 1930s and 40s, and those include things like PVC, polystyrene, plastic bags, a lot of the other plastic goods that we use today. And between 1939 and 1945, plastic production grew exponentially, such that by 1950, there was almost 1.7 million tons of plastic produced every year. Well, today there's about 300 million tons of plastic produced every year, but world population only grew 5 times since 1950. Well, when I say only, 5 times is a lot. But that's a 200-fold increase in the plastic production. As I mentioned, it's used in all types of consumer products, such as straws, the coffee lids, even this pointer I'm using, car parts, telephones, clothing, nylon. Plastics are made from oil, natural gas, and other petroleum-derived chemicals, such that 8% of all oil is used to make plastic products, both in the manufacturing and also just in the product itself. What's the problem with plastic? Well, it doesn't go away, it doesn't disintegrate, it doesn't biodegrade, and it persists in the environment for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. We actually don't know yet because plastic's only been around for 100 years. But on average, about 5 million tons of plastics end up in our oceans every single year. And it's mainly from single-use disposable plastic products, including plastic bags and straws and other things I mentioned before. And there's an unnecessary use of plastic. I mean, when you look at these bananas, yes, they're organic, but did they really need to be wrapped in plastic? Plastics in the ocean, as I mentioned before, there's a place in the Pacific Ocean called the Pacific Garbage Patch, and it's not exactly, you can't see it from space as a specific patch of garbage and trash and plastic in the ocean, but there's so much plastic in the Pacific Ocean with gyres that make it all coalesce together that on some islands and even in far-reaching places, there's plastic where nobody lives. So as plastic does photodegrade in the ocean currents because the sun beats down on the plastic and it actually can reduce the strength of the bonds, and the ocean currents can make it come into smaller pieces, such as what you see in this photograph, they turn into microplastics. And the problem with that is it damages marine ecosystems, including already dying coral reefs. The Great Barrier Reef is sort of on life support. Many articles have come out about that very recently. It entangles or drowns other animals, and it gets consumed by sea animals, from the tiniest little plankton up to the bigger fish. And this can lead to obstruction in whales, dolphins, seabirds. Turtles often mistake plastic bag for their food source of jellyfish, and even fish. And this releases toxins into the animals where it bioaccumulates into their fat. And bioaccumulation means that a small fish might eat a piece of plastic, and then a bigger fish will eat the smaller fish, multiple smaller fish, and then bigger fish will eat multiple and multiple more of those smaller fish, and the toxin just accumulates in their fat and also in their liver, for example. So some of these bioaccumulation chemicals are persistent organic compounds, which get stored, as I mentioned, in the flesh and fat of marine animals. It moves up the food chain. And as humans eat fish and some of these other animals, we are also taking in some of these persistent organic compounds. And in fact, 93% of Americans have been found with BPA in their bodies. Several fish species today sold in the market have actually been found to have plastic residues in them. And I have listed some of my sources for this information. Now, some of these persistent organic compounds have health repercussions, such as fetal or reproductive health problems. Some of them are possible carcinogens, behavioral issues. So as you can see, there's a wide range, and this is only a handful, but there's a wide range of health repercussions that can occur. Now, each person uses about 300 single-use plastic bags each year. I mean, just think about your experience in the supermarket. Do you use a plastic bag every time you grab a couple avocados or some mushrooms? And the answer is probably yes. Each person also uses about 200 single-use plastic bottles every year, and that's just for water. If you think about some sodas and other beverages you might drink, well, it adds up. Only about 7% of all plastics get recycled. So in effect, recycling is kind of a myth for plastic, because when you think of glass or aluminum, those items can actually be 100% recycled, melted, and then reformed into a product. Plastic, on the other hand, cannot be fully broken down and reformed into the original product. It can only be downcycled into, for example, park benches or flooring. Now, moving on to fish and overfishing, about nearly 90% of fish are fully exploited or overfished globally. Now, as you can see from 1974, only about 10% of fish at the time were overfished, and about 40% were underfished. Well, today, actually as of 2013, so even this data, which is the newest data available, which is slightly outdated, only about 10% of fish are underfished, and the other 30% are overfished, and the other 50% of that are fully fished, meaning there is no room to take more than they're already taking. For overfished, they're already depleting the amount of fish of that type. And this occurs from some of the fishing methods like bottom trawling, which is, if you think about it, it's sort of like taking a shovel and dragging it on the ocean floor. Purse seine nets, it's the idea of surrounding a group of fish and then cinching tight the top. And that can lead to a lot of bycatch rates. Gill nets are sort of a hanging curtain where fish or other marine animals can swim into it, but they can't swim out. And then long lining can be hundreds of miles of baited hooks, which unfortunately capture more than just the type of fish that they're looking for. So this can lead to really high bycatch or discard rates, anywhere between 7 and 98% of an individual catch. And unfortunately, shrimp, for example, is one of the highest rates of discards. As you can see, this was an example of shrimp fishing, and in this example, most of what you see here isn't shrimp. Other problems include illegal fishing and then low efficiency aquaculture, where that's farmed fish, where it actually requires more fish to go into the inputs as opposed to what comes out. So you might have to feed a farmed fish 2 to 3 pounds of fish just to get 1 pound of the farmed fish out. A recent 2016 Food and Agriculture Organization report just came out. This is from the United Nations, entitled Fish to 2030. And it said, supplying fish sustainably, producing it without depleting productive natural resources, and without damaging the precious aquatic environment is a huge challenge. We continue to see excessive and irresponsible harvesting in the capture fisheries and in aquaculture. And again, if you refer back to one of my earlier slides, population right now is 7.5 billion people, only to expand. Today, several fish species have been declared critically endangered and threatened with extinction, and this includes the bluefin tuna, certain grouper populations, and even certain swordfish populations. So again, you have to be careful about the type of fish you're eating. When it comes to omega-3s, a lot of people take fish oils even without being expressly told by their doctors or a dietitian. They think it's healthy. There's an aura of health when it comes to omega-3s, or they've read about it in an article. Well, according to the Institutes of Medicine, only the plant-based sources of omega-3, alpha-linolenic acid, has a reference intake value. And it's about 1.7 to 2.4 grams per person per day. DHA and EPA, which generally come from fish, do not have a reference intake value. And the reason for that is because we can synthesize them in our body from the ALA. In addition to that, DHA actually can be obtained from algal sources. And that's actually how fish obtain their DHA. And some of these algae sources are already used in commercial products, such as infant formula. So if you've ever looked at infant formula or you've ever looked at other products that say rich in omega-3s, usually it's because it's supplemented with some microalgae oils. Other good sources of ALA include flaxseed, chia seed, and walnut. In fact, it's only about 2 tablespoons per day. Some other issues around sustainability include conflict palm oil. This can be known as palm kernel or palm fruit oil. The major problem with that is orangutans, Asian elephants, and Sumatran rhinos, it depletes their habitat. So they have rainforest and it gets all cut down, clear cut to grow this palm fruit oil. And it's also a major driver of human-induced climate change because as they clear cut these forests, it reduces a carbon sink, which absorbs carbon from the atmosphere, and instead it releases all that carbon. Palm oil demand has skyrocketed as a replacement for trans fats. The oil is extracted from the fruit of oil palms, as I mentioned, primarily in Indonesia and Malaysia, and there are 20 snack food companies which are primarily responsible. So it can be tricky, but this is just a handful of some of the names of palm kernel oil that is used in products. So going back to my original pop quiz at the beginning, we can go over some of those answers now. What percentage of global greenhouse gases come from agriculture or our food supply? Almost 25%. What percentage of food is wasted or trashed each year? In the United States, about 40%. How many plastic bags and plastic bottles does the average person use in 1 year? 300 bags and 200 bottles. What percent of fisheries are unsustainably overfished? Now, if you remember the graphic I showed you at the very top, it's about 30%, a little more. And how many gallons of water does it take to make a gallon of cow's milk versus a gallon of soy milk? It's 1,000 gallons of water just to produce a gallon of cow's milk, and 300 gallons of water to produce a gallon of soy milk. And I give you that example to show that plant-based sources often are less deleterious to the environment than some of the animal-based. So now for the hopeful part. How can we be more sustainable? First things first, be an informed consumer. Plant-based diets are better for our health and they're better for the environment. In fact, you can grow almost 10,000 times as many calories on 1 acre of land with a plant-based diet as you can with an animal-based. Palm oil, I mentioned before, how it is deleterious to the environment and some species. And then fish oils. I mentioned that earlier in response to the idea of overfishing. Whenever possible, use multi-use products, bags, coffee mugs, instead of single-use plastic products. Eat more plants, crowd out the meat when you're thinking about your dinner plate. If it's too difficult or you really do miss the meat, you can always make it a condiment. Use 1 or 2 ounces of meat instead of your typical 8-ounce steak, but crowd it out with a lot of vegetables. Educate those around you. I mean, most people are not aware of these issues. Most people hear about the driving less, the light switches, the water use. But for many people, this is the first time they're hearing this. Create less waste. Buy only what you will eat. Compost what you cannot, and save leftovers for later. Finally, refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. Whenever possible, refuse the plastic, reduce your use, reuse what you can, and recycle what's left. So in conclusion, something that I've learned as I've discovered this, the impact of our behaviors and our diet on the planet is that which is good for our health is also good for Earth and Earth's environmental health. And we know for a fact that eating a plant-based diet is very good for our health, reduces the risk of chronic diseases, and it is good for the environment. So I think I was told that there are some questions. Thank you. Okay. So what can I do starting today to be more sustainable? Well, first things first, as I mentioned in my presentation, we can reduce our intake of animal products. So one of the things I said was if you crowd out the meat on your plate, only using 1 or 2 ounces, your environmental impact will be significantly less than someone who eats a lot of meat. For example, I hear quite frequently, take a 5-minute shower instead of an 8-minute shower. And you're more than welcome to do that. But if you eat a cheeseburger, that's like taking 3 months worth of showers and driving 20 miles on the highway. So that's one thing you can do starting today to be more sustainable. Another thing you can do is also try to refuse the plastic, because a lot of plastic is used one time and one time only. How much protein do we need? I'm concerned I won't get enough if I go vegetarian or vegan. Okay, I get asked that question a lot. And one of the things that people are concerned about is that they won't get enough protein. And believe it or not, we actually need very little protein to be healthy. Most people need about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So even a 200-pound man who weighs 90 kilograms only needs about 70 grams of protein per day to maintain their muscle mass. And that's not actually all that hard to get from a plant-based diet, because bread usually has 4 to 5 grams of protein per slice. Edamame and other legumes can have 7 to 10 grams of protein in half a cup. Soy yogurts can have 10 grams of protein in a cup. So by mixing and matching your proteins throughout the day, it doesn't have to be all in one meal. You can definitely meet your protein needs. I heard that vegans can become deficient in vitamin B12. Is it true? Well, yes, it is true, because the major source of vitamin B12 is from animal products. However, today it's very easy to get vitamin B12 in a supplemental pill. So if you are vegan or vegetarian and you are concerned that you will not be getting enough B12, you can simply buy a supplement over the counter and take that as insurance. So I think that's all of our questions so far. Thank you so much for joining us today, and happy Earth Day.